2. Good. Yeah, we'll catch up. All right, everyone. The last week of this Mussar study, but hopefully the beginning of a personal journey in this material for you, if you haven't started already. It is an ongoing process. And I think in the last few weeks, I'm going to recap them briefly, we'll learn that little by little we can make progress. It really isn't possible to rectify these things overnight. If you remember one of the quotes, I think from week 2, Rabbi Solanter said, changing one trait, fully, genuinely changing one trait, is harder than learning all of the Talmud, all of Shas, he says, which is unbelievable. That's 7 years of reading and many more years of study to know it and to understand it. So it's not impossible, but it will take time and it will take work. In the past few weeks, we looked at how Derech Eretz is the ethics. It's kind of the non-religious ethical component. And a lot of what Paul was teaching his audience was ethics. All these different cultures were coming together, and he was teaching them the basic ethics. And if you stack Paul's writings next to that particular trait, Derech Eretz of the Talmud, it's almost word for word, some of the ways that he's teaching that. And it makes sense historically. Last week and the week before, we looked at the principles of Mussar and how these are actually important for us to keep the commandments, but also for the process of sanctification. Do we remember that? We're in a state of purity or impurity. Where are we? Not pure. We're in not purity, Peter said, which is true. And then we went through the language of Paul, because I think a lot of people think, oh, we're good. Paul said we're good. Paul's language, as does 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, Hebrews, it gives you the idea that, great, you've been brought to the race. You now qualify for the race. But you have to continue in that. You have to sanctify, become sanctified. There's a process for that. And how we undergo the process of becoming more pure people is actually overlooked. A lot of people overlook that. But we saw that in Paul's language. Get rid of spiritual and physical impurities. Make sense? Good? Okay. I ended on this, somewhere around this slide, because I think I want to start here and kind of bring this back to our forefront, because it's going to make sense. This week we're going to look at the as we call them, the Middot, the actual traits that we need to look at. And there is always a multifaceted approach of how we can become better people. We can suppress the bad habits, bad behaviors. Anger is one. You just learn naturally through life. Exploding on people doesn't really work. It doesn't get you what you want. So naturally, even a kid would learn certain behaviors may not bring the outcome I want. Now, have they rectified? Has the person who suppresses fully rectified it? Maybe not. And that's what we have to work on. We have to understand that this can work. This can be functional and practical in the beginning, but eventually we want to get to root causes. We want to address the idea that we are in this state of impurity and that sanctification process is going to take some work. And when we do that, this is the pathway to holiness. This is how we seek to get closer to the Creator. This is how we explore these topics. Let's say anger. We'll look at these. I'm going to look at these in a little more detail here. We explore anger. Anger is an outcome. What caused my anger? Is it a trauma? Maybe it's a trauma I don't remember that happened. It's suppressed, or regressive, repressed. Somewhere between those two. Is it insecurity? Is it ego, control? What is behind my anger? Because anger is sort of the outcome. What caused it? What are the dynamics behind it? And when we do genuine tikkun, genuine repair, that's how we become truly elevated people to the next level. And even one step into that process is already doing it. You're already doing it. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be working in that direction. And we talked about that. Someone mentioned, that's what, I think, Peter, you might have said that. When Yeshua says, be perfect like your Father in heaven is perfect. Perfection for you might be chasing the end zone for a while, because you're always going to be a better version of yourself every day. Does it make sense? It's relative. Okay. This is why we want to rectify. Rabbi Chaim Vital in The Gates of Holiness, it's a book about the process of holiness. And it's really not overly theological, but so much of what is in this book, which is available in translation now, it hasn't been for most of its history, so much of it is teaching you how to become a better person. And he says, and this is very important, negative character traits are actually much worse than the biblical transgressions. So do you remember, I think it was week 1 or 2, we looked at how the 613 mitzvot are broken into positives and negatives. And sometimes doing a positive mitzvot is a step forward. But not doing it isn't always a sin. Sometimes it's just a missed opportunity. But a transgression is pulling you into a space of impurity. And if you look at the New Testament, all of the commandments that are incumbent upon the Gentiles moving into those synagogues are all prohibitions not to be transgressed. The Ger Toshav, go back to the biblical model. It's all about protecting you from bringing on impurity. And if someone gets started in a journey and they say, I want to keep the commandments, I want to take it on, I want to become a spiritual person, wonderful. But before you begin that journey, you're going to want to make sure you stop doing the things that are going to set you back, right? And you'll hear a rabbi say that sometimes. And I mentioned this example. I know someone who said, I want to keep Shabbat. And they said, well, you're going to hold off a little bit because it's going to destroy the peace in your family. So we're going to prohibit you from doing what is obviously a very good thing because it's going to come at a greater cost. For now, let's protect. Let's guard, right? I can't help it, Lloyd. You brought it up. You want to get healthy. You start taking supplements. But you're going to want to stop the amount of sugar intake, right? Otherwise, you're kind of back and forth, right? There's a process there. So that's the logic. Okay, so negative character traits are, the reason he says this, by the way, is because they're always behind the scenes, influencing how we look at the world, how we react with people. It colors our thoughts, words, and our actions. If we have a generally angry or generally negative or egotistical trait that's unrectified, everything we do is going to come through that filter, right? So we're going to give with the expectation that we're owed something, right? Everything that you do, even if it's good, is going to have a little bit of a coloring of that trait if it's unbalanced. Another great quote from a book that you can't see the title of because it's off the screen. Self-destructive traits, Middot, like anger, arrogance, dishonesty, stinginess, etc., there are more of them, are more than isolated acts. They're deep-rooted patterns of thought and feelings. Again, this is just reinforcing what I said. They're part and parcel of who we presently are. And all of us have a mix of good and bad, balanced and imbalanced traits. All of us do. And that's actually what we're here for. We're here to fix them. And not all of us had religious upbringing. We didn't come from families who had these things right. So our goal may be to get out from under those patterns that we grew up with and thought were normal. One of mine was anger growing up, actually. And for me, that was part of my story. That's part of my tapestry of who I am. Every one of you has some configuration of Middot that have to be explored, rectified from the root, and then you begin to move forward, and you've liberated yourself on that soul level. Right? Good? And lastly, this is very hopeful. This is from the Mussar Torah commentary, and I've been told some people have picked this up since we started this, so that's great. This is a really good book. They go through the Parshiot each week, and they give you a few of the Mussar components which might be useful to you. And I think it's a great book to drop into your cycle just to kind of keep a tab on how it's experienced each week. Rabbi Goldstein says, when we work on our Middot, we clear away the blockages that prevent us from radiating the inner divinity that is our human birthright. So we are made in the image of the Creator. And until we can get rid of some of these blockages, we're separated. And we're also separated from our potential. And this is actually the same language that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 13 when he's talking about Moses saw God face to face, but now we see him in part through lenses or mirrors or glass, right? This blurry glass, that's kind of the language he uses. Well, the mystics talk about that all the time, as does the Talmud. Our layers of diffusion of the light we determine how many layers of occlusion of light we have. We can lessen that to a degree, to a large degree. We can't reach the level, obviously, of some of the great figures, but we can do a lot to clear away the darkness and move into that next level of us, that increased, the part that's getting more light and reflecting more light. Any questions so far? All right. And of course, because I said Mussar can be very dark and heavy at times, you can feel like, I'll never get this. This is very difficult. We're reminded, if someone wishes to purify themselves, heaven will help them. So one step forward, that's right, amen. God will help you, one step at a time. Even if, yeah. And that kind of holds in tension something I'm going to bring up later, and we'll have to go carefully through that a little bit. But the Creator is always with us. The problem is our perception of that. Do we perceive Him to the level that we could? And if not, what are we doing, or what can we remove to increase that perception? But the paradox is that the Creator is always around us at all times and all things. We're always being guided and moved. But the problem is, how much do we perceive that? Are we in darkness so much that we say, I feel like I'm alone here? We can choose that. Okay, so recapping before we get into the mitzvah, the Middot, I keep saying Middot, mitzvah. Mussar helps us recover lost ground from Adam's sin. Remember we went through that step the last few weeks? Here are the things we were created with. Here's what happened to all of them. They're all in deficiency thanks to the event in Genesis. Mussar helps us get a little bit of that back on the spiritual level. It's very important work. It's vital to keeping Torah and seeking God, and we looked at that. And actually, Yeshua's teachings often are, you've heard it said here, but I'm telling you this. He's teaching the Mussar principle. He's teaching the soul of that commandment. He's giving you behind the scenes the white fire, as I said in the Midrash, look, the compassion and mercy behind a literal commandment. You can keep them literally, but you're doing better if you understand that higher level component, the soul level component. And then lastly, like I said, the Creator will help us begin. So this is what I want us to remember. This will be online, I think, all the weeks. If Aaron gets this one up there. Is it streaming?
This shouldn't be online.
Okay, it should be online. Okay. But this will ground us, because what do I need to waste time doing this for? I'm just going to read the partial. This helps us get back to the Creator. All right. So examples that we looked at. Some of these we're going to dive into real quick. Humility, forgiveness, how we go about forgiving others and forgiving ourselves. These can be very challenging, really challenging. Sometimes people go their entire lives never forgiving somebody for something that 30, 40 years later they may not remember what it was even about. But they've built up so much impurity around it that you can't touch it. Speech. Speech is probably one of the biggest. And I will give you some resources on that. But as I'm reminded, as I'm going through a book, the classic book on speech, every person on earth could benefit from it. It's really one of the most amazing books I'll share with you. Anger. In the rest of those you can read. I'm not going to go read through all of them because we're going to jump right into anger. Now, I want to look at this from a little bit different of an angle. Why is anger bad? Do you remember why from the last few weeks, why did we say anger is bad? It seems like a normal emotion.
It covers up something real that's underneath it. It gets in the way of what's really there.
Okay. It masks what's there?
Yeah, it's like it masks what's there so that you can't acknowledge and work through whatever's actually there and actually grow spiritually.
Okay.
It can morph into other things like lashon hara or murder. As it festers, it can grow.
That's right. Sandy reminded us here that it can be it's the seed of many other problems. Go ahead.
It has a negative consequence that leads to something. And that something, it could be any of those or more. And a combination of things.
Yep. You can go any way.
I've been part of listening online last week and also here with anger. So, for example, Cain killed Abel because of anger that God didn't accept his offering, and the first murder happened because of anger and the sin that happened in front of his stepdaughter or in front of him, and he didn't have been controlling.
And if you analyze that, anger was the outcome, but what led to that? That's the discussion in the commentaries.
I want to specify, because it says angry with a brother or sister specifically. Like anger in general, I shouldn't say that. I meant like this particular type of anger, though. Like it's covering up unforgiveness, offense, all sorts of things that need to be worked out.
Yep.
Well, from an acidic standpoint, when we're angry, we're really saying that we disapprove of what God has allowed to happen. We believe that all things come from Hashem, and we don't accept that. With anger, we put our feet in Hashem's shoes, and it becomes idolatry because we're worshiping ourselves on our own past trauma, hurt, or whatever is there. So we have that prayer at the end of the thing, and he starts before he gets to anger. He starts with jealousy. He says, "May the world's jealousy not come upon me, and may my jealousy not come upon them. May I not become angry today, Hashem. May I not anger you." That concept of accepting and analyzing what's going on, before we react.
Yeah, you just touched on something. The energy changed when you mentioned that because you just hit a nerve. I think Dave's hand, and then go ahead.
So I'm not trying to be argumentative in the slightest. I'm in agreement pretty much.
Come on with it.
No, not this time. But let's also bear in mind that God gets angry, has gotten angry. Yeshua got angry. There must therefore be avenues where anger is acceptable and appropriate. Most of the time, I think we're getting it wrong. But that's something that interests me as well.
Yeah. I think the Torah is written in the language that we can understand. But I think human anger versus divine anger are completely different categories. Just my take on it. And I do think that we don't know how to wield that sword. So it's better we just don't touch it.
Fair.
We'll hurt ourselves and everybody. Did I see another hand? Oh, yes.
I went back and listened to part 1 and part 2 last week that Aaron did have uploaded and was streaming because I wasn't here. And one of the things that as I was listening, and I'm not sure if this is online or whatever, but as far as Mussar, there is a seeing just me, because I grew up in a family of 4 siblings and parents, and then you have your friends and your other friends and your colleagues, and you have this big community of people. And when I was listening to this stuff, I had to continually narrow my mind and say, no, this is about you. Stop saying, oh, that's what somebody else does. And that's something that I don't know if there's a way to address it, but this is a very personal experience that my sister and siblings can't make me angry. Right. There's something other people can't make me angry or jealous or emotional or lacking humility. Yeah. So there's that was just really something that I wanted to bring up because it was just as I was listening and as even listening today, it's intense.
Yeah, there are. We'll look at that in a little bit. There are times when we will have to think outside of ourselves, but there is an ownership over these. I can choose not to get angry. Peter and then Laura.
I just have a very simple comment. Actually, very similar to what Dave was saying. Like in this parsha we're reading, of course, where God says, "I was angry with you," at Kadesh Barnea, when you refused to go with what I expected you to obey, and you didn't. And so, you have to ask yourself a question: why is God angry with the people of Israel? And so it seems that God does experience anger, and we can experience anger that is like God's anger. So like in previous parsha we just read Pinchas, that's the whole idea of him being angry in the same way that God would be angry, and angry on God's behalf rather than his own behalf, because he felt the heart of God so much. He was moved by the same passions and things that God is moved by. So there is that type of anger, but that is not the common human anger, essentially. In the sense that to say that anger is not entirely bad. We do see this in the scriptures all throughout. But most of the time, as James said correctly, we just can't wield that sword because our nature, being so corrupted, we end up turning that anger in the wrong direction. We swing in the ways that it should not swing and end up hurting everyone around us.
So to follow up on what he said, it was my question. So is anger light or darkness? Because it cannot be from God, because in God is light, and in him there is no darkness.
Right. This is that, we spoke about this earlier on, this is the duality we live in this existence. We live in a world where evil and good are possible. But in the this is what James says in 1:17. From his perspective, he's in control of all of it. From our perspective, we see shades. Josh?
I just thought of, when you were bringing that up, there's this concept of, for example, Noah was righteous for his generation. And so what was righteous at that time is not righteous at our time. Like we see that as unrighteousness, certain types. So the way anger is referenced during, like for example, with Pinchas, that's a very different time. For him at that time, that could have been attributed as righteous for anger, but today it may not be in that form. You know what I mean? So we grow as a generation, we grow in our spirituality. So
We do.
we have to take that into consideration. Be very, like you were saying, be very careful how we wield anger today.
Yeah, and so this goes back. I want to show again some examples here. Be angry. This is from the sages to a Jewish community. Do not get angry and you won't sin. So they see, as some of you have said, there is a correlation between getting angry and then what comes after it. Now, when they're writing to the Ephesians, Paul is writing to all these different cultures. But he has some very similar message. Be angry, but don't sin, right? I don't think it's practical to say don't get angry anybody ever, because it's going to happen. But if you do, be very careful of what follows it.
We have in Brit Chadashah and in our Siddur, there's an answer. So it says, don't let the sun set on your anger and your wrath. And every night, when we begin the Shema, the very first paragraphs are letting people go.
Letting go of that anger.
I release them, don't let them be harmed on my account. If they've harmed me physically, financially, list all the things out. And so it gives you an opportunity every night to release anger and not let it turn into bitterness.
It's a beautiful point. So if you haven't seen that in the Siddur, or if you have one, obviously, at home, Bedtime Shema gives about 2-paragraph cleaning of the slate for everybody. It's a really great thing.
I would say God anger, and it's also, I would say, a parent anger toward the child. It's totally different than you have anger for one adult to another. When we look at our Father is creator of all. His anger as a father to his children. That's why we see in the Bible all the time when he angry about something that they didn't obey for his commands.
Yep.
When you look in when, for example, you angry about your kid that didn't do the dishes, homework, everything, it's not for your anger because something that from some evilness, but it's something that you expect from your son that will step on in responsibility and other end when he don't do it. It's you're angry about that and you're punishing him, but that anger don't come from evilness or sin.
Right, discipline is a good. Yeah, and that's a whole brilliant topic in itself. Anger, retributive anger, and disciplinarian anger. Now I want to move into this next phase that Anthony touched on, because this is where anger gets dangerous. The particular type of anger that gets dangerous. Zohar in many places says when someone loses their temper, it's like they're worshiping idols. Now, backing off of this, someone would say, "Oh, that sounds harsh." If you look at, we did this for Rosh Hashanah a few years ago. We looked at 4 types of sin: Chet, Avon, Avera, and Fasha. The last 2, Averot, are idolatry, murder, anger. These are starting to step from inadvertent or crimes of passion into more intentional type sins. And then Fasha is the worst kind. So what the Zohar is saying is what Jesus said. Wait, I don't have it on this one. What the Zohar is saying is what he said. If you get angry, you're going to be subject to the judgment. If you call your brother a fool, you're going to the judgment. Not to say that that is the same on the practical, functional level, being angry and worshiping idols. What he's talking about is the soul level. Both of those bring a level of impurity to you that's roughly the same. That's what he's saying. Go ahead, Josh.
Because I was worshiping, idol worshippers at the time were very, they would kill, they would sacrifice people without a second thought. And so murder was not a concept, like it wasn't an issue to them. Is it possible, like, I hear losing temper, you become a person that would possibly be willing to do the same thing as an idol worshiper in that way, kill with impunity, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it takes you into some dangerous territory similar, or maybe even the same actions. What I'm understanding this as, and generally the way that this is looked at from that purity, if you start to traverse into the category called averot, you are taking on a significant level of impurity, and that's why many times Jesus says slander, greed, these are the things that separate you from the Creator. These are the things that defile you, as he says in, Mark 7? Slander, greed. Now, in our legal system, we talked about this in the last 2 weeks, our legal system doesn't put murder and insulting somebody in the same category. But in the system, the economy of impurity, spiritual impurity, you're in the same ballpark. You're hitting the same threshold of separation from the Creator. Did somebody have a hand up?
You went there. I was just going to say what Josh was saying was that when we're in that anger, usually the first thing that's going to come out is Lashon Hara.
Yeah.
Very first thing. We're going to disagrate our brother in some way, or sister, however you want to place it, somewhere in our anger. It don't even have to be in the moment of heat. It could be down the road, and you're triggered, that point of trauma, and then you spill out. You're emptying out, and so now we've entered into something that's deeper.
Yeah.
Now it's attached to us more than the emotion. It's more an attachment to you bringing in that thing, and it's attached to you. You got to work really hard to get rid of Lashon Hara. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that, at least in my life, that I have to constantly check myself.
Well, so Tish B'Av is about Lashon Hara. This is what all the teachings are coming back to: baseless hatred and Lashon Hara, because it's what people go into exile for. It's what temples are destroyed for. And why? Again, don't look at the physical. We're so locked into the physical, material explanation of these things. Look at the spiritual dimension to it. Why is Lashon Hara so bad? Because the Creator created everything through words, and we use that same gift, which we have uniquely, and we use it for curse, for evil, it's not even, like I said in the past, it's not stigmatized in our society. So have at it. Your entire website's dedicated to gossip and slander and trashing people.
It's our whole governmental system, electing the president, it's groomed into us from that point.
It's totally acceptable.
It's acceptable.
But when we're still in a point of jealousy and a point of egotistic, because when we begin to speak, something happens, we speak Lashon Hara about the other person. What we're trying to do is bring them down. I mean, we're desecrating them. We're in the same position that is when I don't know if the Torah says it, but the Talmud talks about that we can't speak negative of a dead person because they're not here to defend themselves from their point of view. And we're the same thing we're doing, even though they're living, we're doing the exact same thing of bringing death upon them,
I think I have that verse coming up in a little bit. Sandy?
It's hard to hear everybody, so if this was already said, sorry. But I think of worshiping idols in this type of situation. Actually, ourself would be the biggest one. They are a lot of times in anger. And a lot of them that we actually end up worshiping our own self in that sense.
Yeah, okay, so that's another dimension to this, which is why we're not allowed to take revenge. We can't take revenge on people because the sages understood that revenge is assuming that God had nothing to do with that person. And Peter, you said it in the prayer earlier. Whatever happens is in some way through the Creator, right? So the idea is, if you, and like I think you said early on in this frame, we're forgetting that the Creator is somehow orchestrating and in charge of everything. So anger causes a need to bring revenge on a person. The Torah says, don't take revenge. It's God's. God will do that. But it's also telling you that there's something you can learn from it. And I don't want to get into the extremes of that, because there are times when someone needs to go to jail and you need to follow that process through for what they did. But generally speaking, someone saying something online, like about you, or disagreeing with a comment, like, we got to be careful. So again, you about to say something? Okay, I saw your hand. Now I want to show you how the sages take this and they apply it in their life. So anger, Reish Lakish says, anyone who becomes angry, and this, by the way, is a rabbi who was at one point a gladiator before he was like brought in to study. And then he became a great Torah scholar. He was a highway robber. Yeah, he had a really bad past. But it's a great story. Any person who becomes angry, he's talking about anybody, but if he is a Torah scholar, his wisdom departs him. Now, there's more than just like things you learned that he's talking about. There's a level of connectivity to the Creator is what he's talking about. That's the code word here for wisdom. If he's a prophet, prophecy departs him. And we see that in the Torah. We see some prophets who screw up, and very quickly their life goes off a cliff and they're finished. The reason they're talking about this, again, is the spiritual dimension. Prophecy, intuition, all of these things are from our connection to the Creator. The more we remove those layers, the closer we get. And that's why prophecy doesn't exist today on a global scale the way we saw in those times, because there's just too much impurity. But on an individual level, I'm sure you've all experienced this. There are times life is going well. You're learning. You're on a good routine. You're studying. You're waking up. Sandy's nodding. You are in step with the Creator. And you're in a different place cognitively than when you fall from that. Right? Seems weird, but we're not talking about God's presence. We're talking about our perception of the Creator. It can be dampened by anger. Sounds crazy, right? No. 1 Thessalonians, do not extinguish the Spirit. Don't treat prophecies with contempt. So in this same run, stay away from evil. You're getting the same teaching. You can destroy your perception of the Creator and darken yourself through impurity if you continue in these other types of evil. And he says it a few times. I think there's another place I may have. There's a couple places, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Hebrews again. It's giving you the spiritual economy of how you can stay in step with the Creator. But I think a lot of us sometimes we zero into the physical level. All right, next one. Okay, I'm doing okay. Arrogance. So I want to put arrogance into the context, which I think all of us have. And I try not to get involved in these, but arguments, right? Arguments. People will say, "Oh, I don't agree with that." We have to be very careful how we engage with people, especially in these religious, because we find ourselves at a crossroads. We have other mainstream religions and people who are well-meaning that don't like our space. They don't like this middle space that Messianic Judaism falls into. And they'll argue, but they'll sometimes argue without awareness of the impurity that they're bringing on themselves. We, as the people who are studying this, we need to be careful of that. So we have to ask, when we get into an argument, is it for the sake of heaven? Is it based on genuine intentions to help someone, right? If we're wrong, are we open to new information? That's a big problem if you're not. A lot of people aren't. You just want to come in and hammer this home. Is your argument stemming from ego or arrogance? If it is, you have to abandon that. You have to be very careful. And then last, is yours for the sake of heaven? And is it possible that theirs is also? There's a great story of the Baal Shem Tov, and someone who heard about him and thought he was what would you call it? He was misleading. He's a deceiver. And he gathered up some stones, and he was going to go throw stones at him when his carriage passed, because he knew he was going to be in town. And the man goes out, and he sees him praying as he has his hands on the stones to throw them. And he sees him praying, and he kind of waits for a couple minutes, because you don't want to interrupt somebody who's praying. You'll get in trouble for that. He had the sense to know. But then the Baal Shem Tov turns and greets him so warmly and so genuinely, and he sees that this isn't at all what I was told about him. This guy is actually a really good guy. And he drops his stones and he walks away. Just, good thing. He drops his stones. And the Baal Shem Tov told one of his students to go pick up those stones and keep them, because they have holy intention. Those stones were picked for a holy intention. He was misguided, but he can recognize that the lesson is that even though someone's arguing with us, sometimes, not all times, sometimes they may actually believe this is for the Creator. My argument is for the sake of heaven. We have to be careful of that, because even if they're wrong, there's a chance that we could be bringing damage on ourselves if we are misreading that. So we have to respect other people's opinions. Okay. Arrogance. Every arrogant person is an abomination to God. So you can imagine the impurity that comes from this, right? In fact, Tractate Brachot says an arrogant person drives off the divine presence. So there again is that idea of quenching the spirit, this extinguishing the spirit, losing that perceptive ability. Go ahead.
So it sounds like arrogance basically comes from a root of pride that seems to blind from, and it has all of those attributes that you just mentioned.
Yeah. Arrogance is a combination. And it can also, it's when we don't see the Creator, we see us as the top of the pyramid.
Let's not confuse, as many do nowadays, especially in postmodern American culture, arrogance with certitude or feeling like we have a good grasp on what's true. Because that will be labeled arrogance, and it's not the same thing. It's not necessarily the same thing.
Right. Just because someone says you're arrogant doesn't mean you're arrogant. You have to. But what I'm talking about is, I think what Johnny Sue said. We have to do the inner work to figure out, where are we coming from? This person just said this to me, and I'm going to answer. The sages say, wait a little bit. Explore. Go through that checklist. Where is this coming from? What's my intention here? What is their intention? Do I think, I think I have it coming up. If I do, so be it. I'll just say it again. Is this person just arguing to argue, right? Because if that's the case, there's a mitzvah to not answer them. Pearls before swine. It's a mitzvah to abandon that, leave it. Who cares? Let them continue to run comments in that thread. Doesn't matter. It's a mitzvah to not engage. We see this in Mark. Again, adultery, deceit, debauchery, slander, pride. Again, 2 Timothy. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant. So even just look at some of these. These are kind of normal issues we have in our culture today, right? Every day. And we have to be careful, because we could get lured into that. And what happens to us? We take steps away from that connection with the Creator. Sins of speech. This is the biggest one. We could finish on this one. I'm going to try to get through it. But I will give you a resource. As Anthony was saying, this is one of the biggest ones. It's at the root of the sin of Adam. The sin of Adam came from bending words, right? Misusing speech. The exiles, pretty much all the exiles, the destructions of the temple, right? The exiles came from the spies. They gave a bad report. Joseph went into exile in Egypt because he gave a bad report on his brothers. Everything has some component of Lashon Hara to it. And our current state of separation from the Creator is from Lashon Hara. Now, this is where it gets challenging. It can be boasting, idle talk, insulting. Embarrassing others is unbelievably destructive. And we see that in the Torah. And particularly in the case with David. Speaking falsehood, exaggerating, lying, flattering. Evil speech it's multifaceted. It's not just speaking, it's listening to it. And in a little bit, we're going to look at how that gets even deeper, because if we're speaking it to somebody, we're making them listen to it. So degrees. Complaining. Complaining is in the ballpark of, I don't think that the Creator has anything to do with this, or I don't see the Creator's hand in this. Saying, was that?
Yeah, I don't like what he's doing.
Yeah. Saying anything that casts someone in a negative light, even if it's true. It's a level of Lashon Hara, which at times, maybe in legal cases, information has to be brought forward, but most of the time in day-to-day interactions, don't cast someone in a negative light. unless it's like, there are, and I didn't even make an attempt to explain them here, there are criteria listed in the Chafetz Chaim's book of when it's acceptable and the cases when you have to or when you could. I don't want anyone to leave thinking that I've understood them. So read the book if you're interested in understanding this. And then lastly, causing someone else to sin through speech, right? You know someone doesn't like a certain person and you mention them in that person's presence. You know it. You know what will come from that.
So there's casting someone in a negative light. I mean, I think that's the tricky one always. But I'm thinking of Tochecha, the commandment to actually speak truth into a person's life when someone is completely off the path and they need correction, and you may actually be that person. Obviously, it has to be done in the right way, in the right spirit. It doesn't, but sometimes that can be perceived as, that unfavorable speech, essentially. But because the other person, as far as they're concerned, they're on the right path, and you're having to take them off of that.
Yeah, and there are times when, of course, these things are necessary, but the people have put thought into how you can walk that very fine line and do it without damaging yourself. Okay, so I'm going to go through these quickly. Again, do not quench, do not extinguish the Holy Spirit of God through bitterness, anger, wrath, right? We see that again. Be careful of the impurity you're bringing on yourself. Now, a lot of people are not aware this dimension exists in the New Testament, but, it does. James, we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he said, he's a perfect person, a complete person, is what we said week 1, in Adam Shlema. Right? Also able to bridle his whole body. In this, he's talking about speech. He's talking about the necessity of guarding the tongue. It's a really good chapter. It's very much like Chafetz Chaim. Matthew, every word we speak we'll have to answer for, right? Do we think about that? Do we remember that from time to time? That's in line with the sages. They say the same thing. Did I see a hand? I'm sorry. Okay. This is what I was saying earlier, Bava Metzia. Anyone who humiliates another in public, it's though they were spilling blood. Now, someone again would say, come on, that's not the same. But again, spiritual dimension here. We're talking about the level of impurity you brought on yourself through doing that. Right? I see you, Vic. You're in that argument with somebody, you know you could destroy them. And you choose not to because you will have disconnected yourself in a major way. Go ahead, Drew.
I mean, it actually says that verbatim in Leviticus, do not stand on the blood of your brother.
Yeah, and these are all sourced from the Torah, one way or another. Go ahead, Drew.
I will say about that, even today, you see, and it's very clearly in the social media, you have, especially with kids, that sometimes they're not exactly like a teenager, they actually humiliate someone on the Facebook, Twitter, and everything, and you see hearing something like suddenly a year later, that person makes suicide.
Yeah.
So that is very important thing that we need to do.
Becomes quite literally spilling somebody's blood. Contributed to their image being so publicly tarnished that they feel like they can't come back from that. I mean, this is a very real problem.
And then I think that all of us know, like, there is a spiritual toll that comes from that. Whether the law finds the connection or not, we know that there's...
Sticks and stones, is not really true.
Yeah.
It's not just for men.
Yeah, I mean, I think doing that, it's akin to cutting someone. I mean, it emotionally hurts them the same way, and it lasts. It takes time to heal, and that's real damage you're doing to somebody.
Yep.
Regardless
Speech
of
is
how
powerful.
separate you become of God, you're really hurting that person.
And you're misusing speech.
I used to wonder, as a young person, how in the world you could slay somebody with your tongue. James spoke about this. Now I know that every time you diminish the image of it in the mind of someone, in the mind of another, you have cut him, and he is bleeding. And if you keep doing it in the minds of enough people, could it result in physical death or spiritual death?
Absolutely.
On one side or the other.
And I think I'm going to move ahead here. This is the set. If you want to jump in, and we do have this in the back. on the shelf.
You can test it.
But I would get this version if you're just starting off. They make it very simple, one a day, and you can read it. It's the Daily Companion. And I have the small version. Aaron got the larger version. I would get the larger version. It's a lot easier to read. But this is probably one of the biggest ones in our day. Yet David's holding it up. It's a very small set. It's like pocket size. I think it's intentional. Very, very good book on this volume on this topic. Okay, the last one I want to do before we run out of time here. Did I see a hand?
I just wanted to suggest another book that encompasses all of this, and it's just an amazing. It will leave you feeling guilty on every page. It's called,
Thank you.
yeah, it's called the Code to Jewish Ethics by Rabbi Talushkin. It's a masterpiece of how you're supposed to interact with others and how mindful you have to be of every situation. If you're speaking with somebody that's more ignorant than you, do not show yourself as smarter. If somebody, just you can gobble that all up and realize how it's very hard to do.
So wonderful. The Guide to Jewish Ethics, Talushkin.
Jewish ethics, yes.
Yeah, so that's what I want to get to with stumbling others. It's more complicated. There is, to your point, we're supposed to think outside of ourselves into what I could do that could stumble this person. Right? One example was causing someone to listen to Lashon Hara. I'm speaking it. I'm inadvertently making them listen to it. So I'm causing trouble on their part, which is bad enough when it's just yourself. But nobody does that. I don't think they speak Lashon Hara to themselves. It's always somebody else. Right? Giving bad advice. So giving someone advice that's not accurate or true or helpful, that's another way of abusing speech and stumbling people. Because I'll go to the verse next. Bringing up events that might embarrass somebody. So you tell a story about something that embarrassed, or that was so embarrassing for somebody that they outlived, and you keep bringing it up. You're embarrassing them. You're stumbling them. You're causing them to have to deal with, again, that memory, that situation. Causing divisions. Useless arguments, right? People love it. Online it's so easy. Just type what you want, hit enter. Don't even think about it. Mentioning topics that can trigger...
People worry about the fallout.
Was that?
It's like let the other people who are reading it worry about the fallout that your comments cause.
Yeah, or people just, they don't think of this dimension. They don't think outside themselves. Inciting others, right? So one example is not paying a laborer's wages. And this comes from, I think the verse, it's very close to what you were talking about, Drake. You shall not insult the deaf. And Anthony, I think that was what they tie that to. The deaf. Somebody who, not just somebody who's physically deaf, somebody who can't hear what you're saying because they're not present. And then the other is placing a stumbling block before the blind, right? And the blind, they don't have to be someone who's actually blind. It's somebody who doesn't see what you're doing. They don't perceive what you're doing. And you see stumbling all the time in Paul's letters. He's teaching people not to stumble others, right? These are, you're causing others, like Matthew 18:6 and Luke 17:2. He's talking about causing children to sin, causing other people to sin.
Just to be clear, there's language of stumbling a lot of times in the Torah, and certainly in Brit Hadashah all the time, is just an idiom for sin. So to stumble means to fall into a transgression of some sort, to sin.
Yeah. Now, I think I'm at time here. How much time do we have, Peter?
To wrap it up. Let's do a few more minutes.
Okay. I'll try to make it 3 more minutes. Okay. So we have to be careful with what we're doing and how that other person may react to it, which means we have to kind of have a little bit of empathy, get into their mind, and be careful with how we proceed with certain things that we say and what we do. Make sense? Because this is what the Torah is calling us to do. It's calling us to think outside of our perspective. Instead of what you said is wrong, maybe, well, how did you get to that? I like to see...
It's the two main commandments. Love God, love others.
Yeah.
How can we not live that out?
Right. Kind of looking at the world around us and trying to be sensitive to what we're putting into the world and how others receive it. Okay. And again, in the context of disputes, I want to ground this in something that I think is very common today. A dispute can bring us into a lot of hazards. These are the last 2 slides I had, so I'll just do these real quick. like we said, anger can be many different things, and it can lead to other things. Some of these things, these experiences like disputes, can actually bring us into anger, arrogance, lashon hara, dishonoring others, not giving other people the benefit of doubt, embarrassing them, and then all of this falls into the category of desecrating the name of God, Chilul Hashem, which is very dangerous. So we must be careful again. All of these go into our motivations. What am I doing this for? Is this productive? Is this person looking for answers, or are we arguing for no reason here, right? And do this in all of these experiences, because I think these are important. And this is what I mentioned earlier. If we find ourselves in a dispute and we know it's not going anywhere and there's no positive reason for it, the sages say something like this too, but hold your tongue. It's not worth it. It's not worth risking the damage and the impurity that will come from you. And part of that goes into, in the case of these discussions we get in these interfaith things, a treasure must not be revealed to everyone, the Jerusalem Talmud says. So also the precious words of Torah. One must not go into the deeper meaning of them, except in the presence of those individuals who are suitably trained. So when I was taking, this is years ago, it was in the church, they had a class on apologetics. And first or second week of that class, I felt like I needed to back out of it. There was a statement made by a particular author in a book, and it was highlighting how apologetics and arguing your point, trying to force people to see your point, can be damaging. And the statement said something to the effect of, the person who apparently knew more said to a person arguing with them, well, I would have believed the same thing if I knew as little as you did. Which, to me, like, okay, then maybe that's not a good spiritual path to be getting into arguments with people if that's where you move yourself cognitively. Go ahead, David.
I mean, that's basically an ad hominem attack. I mean, you should never make those kinds of character assassinations, ad hominem attacks. You want to, judge something based on the merits of their argument or based on the merits of their actions.
Yeah. And you fall so many rungs of that ladder in the process. Okay, last. What was that?
The arrogance he's putting down to, now you're equal.
Yeah, now you're probably lower. All right, so here, last slide of this 4-week series. Identify a few traits to begin with. Go look them up online. There's probably more. There might be one that resonates with you. Maybe that's something you need to jump into. Start off with a goal. What is your goal? What do you want to work on? What will 1 month of studying that look like? Will it be you purchase a book and you start to study it? Do you have an idea of what it looks like? Anytime, anywhere. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to go on a trip to do this. You can start the work now. You can start this on the way home. You can get angry one less time driving. Make use of spare time, right? Focus. You're standing in line. You have nothing else to do. Focus on what you want to do. What am I going to work on? How can I work on that in this minute? And then don't give up. Find a friend. Go through the book together. Check in weekly. Do a study as a community. I think this would be really good. Shafat Chaim's book would be an amazing book for the group to go through. But this is how we do it. One step at a time. Heaven helps us every step of the way. And this is how we become a holier community.